Act 1. An ordinary morning in St. Mary Mead. To Mary Mead, at first glance, was the very picture of English village tranquillity. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows, the church bell had just tolled 9, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the Bluebell tea-room. Along the main lane, Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Hartnell, armed with their wicker baskets, exchanged their usual pleasantries as they lingered by the grocer's display of apples and rhubarb. Terribly chilly for this time of year, Mrs. Bartlett declared, tugging her shawl more securely around her plump shoulders. Miss Hartnell, a retired governess with particularly strong views on the decline of modern manners, gave a stiff nod. Unseasonably so. And have you heard? Whatever shocking tidbit was on the verge of being shared was cut short by the hasty arrival of young Nancy, the grocer's assistant, who came barreling out of the shop, pale-faced and breathless. "It's Mr. Abbott," she gasped. "They found him dead." A moment of stunned silence followed. Then, as though a stone had been dropped into still waters, whispers rippled outward. The first real scandal in years had arrived. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the Abbott cottage, Constable Henry Graves was already looking harassed. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a sigh, adjusting his cap. "I should have known you'd come poking about." Miss Marple, the very picture of innocent curiosity, clasped her hands in front of her neat woolen coat. "Oh, Henry dear, I simply happened to be taking a little walk. It's all very distressing, you know, poor Mr. Abbott." The constable sighed, glancing at his notebook with the expression of a man who rather wished someone else was dealing with this. "Looks like natural causes." Found in his chair, peaceful, Miss Marple's brows lifted just so. "Peaceful." Graves hesitated. "I mean, no visible struggle, but there was something odd." Miss Marple waited, knitting the air with her fingers. Graves sighed. "Someone left a playing card, King of Hearts, right on the table next to him." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Oh, my dear Henry," she said gently, "I do believe you'll find this was no natural death at all." A scent of damp earth clung to the morning air as Miss Agatha Marple walked briskly toward the modest brick building that housed the St. Mary Mead police station. It was an unassuming structure. Tidy, practical, entirely in keeping with the village's reputation for orderliness. The door creaked slightly as she stepped inside, an entryway marked by the faint scent of tobacco and oiled leather. At the desk sat Constable Henry Graves, a sturdy, middle-aged man with a thick moustache and the expression of one who preferred his peace undisturbed. His uniform was neat but slightly worn at the elbows, as if he had spent too much time leaning against things in contemplation. He looked up from a ledger and, upon seeing Miss Marple, exhaled in the resigned manner of a man about to be outmatched. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, standing and dusting off his hands as if the morning's work had been more strenuous than it truly was. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Miss Marple smiled, an innocent grandmotherly smile that had disarmed many a man into revealing more than he ought. "Oh, Henry, you know as well as I do that St. Mary Mead is not accustomed to disturbances, and when there is one, well, it would be rather negligent of me not to take an interest." Constable Graves sighed, then gestured toward a wooden chair across from his desk. "I suppose there's no stopping you then?" She settled herself with a delicate rustling of skirts and folded her hands primly in her lap. "Of course not, dear. Now, tell me what you know." Graves hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Oh, as you've probably heard, Mrs. Timms found the body early this morning. It was Mr. Peter Abbott, retired schoolmaster. Good man by all accounts, quiet, kept to himself." He leaned forward slightly. "Thing is, it don't make much sense. The door was locked from the inside, no sign of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. Miss Marple inclined her head, knitting her brows in thought. Curious, she murmured. And where was he found exactly? His sitting room. In his chair, like he just nodded off. Except... Graves hesitated, his mouth twitching slightly. Except for what, Henry? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath the softness. Graves sighed. Except someone had placed a single playing card on the table in front of him. The King of Hearts. Miss Marple's fingers twitched ever so slightly before she resumed her usual composure. How very theatrical, she said lightly. And you've no notion why? None, Graves admitted. No enemies that I know of. Lived alone since his wife passed. Didn't gamble as far as I've heard. No debts, no grudges. It's just... odd. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting toward the window, where outside the village hummed along as if murder were not quietly staining its otherwise tranquil air. And you believe it to be a straightforward case of natural causes? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Graves shifted uncomfortably. Well, Dr. Ellsworth hasn't given a formal ruling yet, but there's no sign of violence, no bruises, no wounds, just a man who appears to have died peacefully in his chair. Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger against her chin. It all sounds perfectly ordinary, except for one thing. Graves frowned. What's that? The playing card. She let the words settle between them, watching as the constable shifted in his chair. You see, Henry, people rarely trouble themselves to leave behind such an enigmatic touch unless they mean to say something. And the fact that Mr. Abbott, a most respectable and unremarkable man, was chosen as the recipient of such a message, suggests rather strongly that there is more to this than meets the eye. Graves scratched at his mustache, sighing. You always manage to make things more complicated than they need to be. Miss Marple smiled again, serenely this time. Oh, my dear, it is never I who make things complicated. It is people who do that all on their own. There was a brief silence as Graves flipped through his notes, avoiding her gaze. Miss Marple observed him keenly, detecting the faintest hint of unease in the way he hesitated. You seem troubled, she observed. More than usual. Graves hesitated before speaking. It's just... this isn't the first odd thing to happen lately. Who? There was that business with Mrs. Pendleton's missing letters last week. And old Mr. Finch swears someone's been moving his garden tools at night, though I chalked that up to forgetfulness, but now this... He gestured vaguely at his notes. Nah, maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's something. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but something sharp flickered behind her eyes. I rather think, Henry, she said thoughtfully, that it is something. A moment later she rose, smoothing her skirt. Well, I shan't take up any more of your time. You have so many important things to attend to. She smiled sweetly, which had the curious effect of making Graves sit up straighter. As she made her way toward the door, the constable called after her, Miss Marple, you're not planning on getting involved in all this, are you? She paused, turning slightly, the light from the window catching the silver strands in her neatly styled hair. Henry, I wouldn't dream of it. She left him sitting there, frowning at his papers as she stepped out into the fresh air of St. Mary Mead, her mind already ticking away like a well-oiled clock. She had every intention of getting involved. Miss Agatha Marple's sitting room was a small, cosy haven of order and quiet reflection. It smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax, the fire in the grate crackling softly as afternoon light filtered through lace curtains. On the surface, it was the picture of genteel domesticity. Floral china, neatly arranged bookshelves, and a knitting basket within arm's reach. But for those who knew her well, It was a place of contemplation, of careful study, where more puzzles had been solved than perhaps even the St. Mary Mead police station. She sat at a small escritoire, her hands resting lightly on an old leather-bound village registry, its pages yellowed with age. A small notepad lay beside it, already bearing a few neat annotations. To an observer, she might have appeared to be indulging in nothing more than an afternoon of reminiscing, but in reality, Miss Marple was deep in the kind of thought that turned over each detail, each anomaly, with quiet precision. She had seen crime before. She understood its mechanics. A murder, despite all its theatrics, was rarely about drama. It was about human nature, about greed, about fear, about secrets buried beneath polite smiles. And the murder of Peter Abbott, an unremarkable schoolmaster, had all the hallmarks of something deeply personal, disguised as something impersonal. She turned a page and ran her finger over the familiar, elegant script. St. Mary Mead's history was filled with small intrigues, quiet feuds, and hushed scandals. The kind of things villagers tucked away in their collective memory, only to have them resurface when the right storm of circumstance arrived. And that was when her eye caught something. Her finger paused over a name. Rupert Abbott. The surname was no coincidence. The year listed was 1879, next to a brief but telling note, "Scandal at the vicarage." Rupert Abbott dismissed from parish posts, a quiet scandal forgotten by most, but not by her. Miss Marple's mind flickered back to whispered conversations long ago. A vicar's son caught up in some impropriety whose disgrace had led the family to quietly relocate. Could it be connected? A long shadow cast over the present. Her gaze moved to her notepad where she had already scribbled the words, "King of Hearts." An unusual signature for a murderer, to be sure. People often left messages at crime scenes out of arrogance, out of a need to be understood. But a playing card, especially that one, was not a mere flourish. It meant something. And then, unbidden, the lines of an old nursery rhyme drifted into her mind. The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen she wept, the knave he fled, and ne'er was seen again. She sat back in a chair, fingertips pressed together. She had heard it many times as a child, hummed absent-mindedly in village halls, recited in sing-song voices by nursemaids and governesses. Stolen tart, the Queen weeping, the knave disappearing. A story of betrayal and punishment, of loss and retribution. Her mind shifted back to Peter Abbott. A quiet man, living alone, the sort no one would think to harm. But someone had thought to harm him, and they had done so with purpose. She shut the book with a quiet snap and reached for her cup of tea, which had long since gone cold. This was not a murder of passion, nor one of opportunity. This was something more deliberate, something with roots tangled deep in the past. And when roots were tangled, it was always best to seek out those who had tended the soil before. Miss Marple placed the book back on the shelf and smoothed her skirt. It was time to call upon Dolly Bantry, and perhaps, she thought wryly, to take a small detour past the church records on the way. Dolly Bantry's house, the Grange, was a handsome affair, a slightly sprawling country residence that had long since settled into the comfortable disarray of an estate too large for its current occupants. A place where furniture had been collected rather than arranged, where the scent of lavender polish battled with the faintest trace of cigar smoke from a husband who, despite being retired, still treated his study as a gentleman's club. The house had seen its fair share of scandal, nothing outrageous, of course, but the kind of whispered village tales that grew richer with time. And Dolly Bantry, full of irrepressible curiosity and keen-eyed interest, had always been at the heart of them. Miss Marple arrived at the sight of Dolly herself, framed against the entrance in a smart tweed skirt and a floral blouse, her grey-streaked curls pinned back in the practical fashion of a woman who had once had housemaids, but now made do with a harried cook and an occasional gardener. "My dear Jane," Dolly called cheerfully as Miss Marple stepped out of the hired cab. "You've come just in time. I was about to have a rather dull tea alone, and you know I despise being left to my own company. It only leads to dreadful thoughts, usually about house repairs." Miss Marple smiled, stepping onto the gravel path. "And here I thought I was simply paying a social visit. But if I can rescue you from contemplating leaking conservatories, I shall consider my afternoon well spent." Dolly laughed, looping her arm through Miss Marple's as she led her inside. "Oh, heavens, yes. Arthur insists nothing is wrong with the roof, but I know for a fact that rain is getting in somewhere, and I do so hate it when he pretends not to hear me." They moved into the drawing-room, a bright and slightly cluttered space where books, dog-eared magazines, and ornamental porcelain fought for dominance over polished mahogany surfaces. There was a large fireplace, unlit but lined with decorative vases, and a set of floral chintz armchairs, well worn but inviting. A tea tray had already been set with delicate china, and a particularly decadent-looking plate of scones, which suggested Dolly had either been expecting Miss Marple or was simply always prepared for the prospect of company. Dolly, never one for preamble, poured the tea and settled into her chair with a knowing smile. Jane, I suspect you haven't come only to discuss Arthur's selective hearing or my failing roof. This has to do with poor Peter Abbott, doesn't it?" Miss Marple, already stirring her tea, did not look surprised. "I thought you might have heard. My dear, you know this village. Of course I've heard. It's been the talk of the morning, and if I had a penny for every theory being whispered in the baker's queue, I could probably fix the entire roof in gold leaf. Mrs. Bartlett is quite convinced he was poisoned, you know." Miss Marple took a sip of tea. "Mrs. Bartlett has always been rather fond of poisons. She's read far too much Wilkie Collins." Dolly grinned. "And then, as the matter of the playing card now, Jane, even you must admit that's rather strange." "Not strange," Miss Marple corrected, setting her cup down. "Deliberate." Dolly leaned forward, intrigued. "So you do think it means something?" Miss Marple gave her a patient look. "People rarely trouble themselves to leave behind such theatrical clues unless they mean to say something. The difficulty is deciphering what it is they're saying." Dolly's brow furrowed. "You know, it reminds me of something, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Some village story from ages ago. A scandal. Though goodness knows we've had our fair share." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "You wouldn't be thinking of the Rupert Abbott affair by any chance?" Dolly's eyes widened. "Why, yes, that was it. Rupert Abbott, wasn't he the vicar's son who— Well, there was some dreadful business, wasn't there, and then he disappeared." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag resting untouched beside her. "Indeed. He left the village in disgrace after an incident involving, how shall we put it, a misappropriation of funds. There were whispers, of course, but nothing was ever proven outright. The family never spoke of it again. And now, all these years later, Peter Abbott is found dead with a playing card at his side, one that happens to correspond to a rather old nursery rhyme about betrayal." Dolly tapped a finger against her teacup. "Oh, that is interesting." Do you think someone's dredging up old grievances? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Grievances in villages are like dandelion seeds, my dear. They may scatter, but they always find a way of taking root again. Dolly pursed her lips. And do you think dear Henry Graves has any notion of what's really going on? Miss Marple's expression held the kind of patience reserved for exasperating but well-meaning men. Henry Graves is a competent constable, but I fear he is looking for a crime with an immediate and logical explanation. What we have here, I suspect, is something rather more layered. Dolly, never one to resist a good mystery, sat forward eagerly. Well, Jane, it sounds like you need a few fresh perspectives. Who do you plan to speak with next? Miss Marple's smile was polite, but there was something sharp behind it. Oh, I think a few discreet conversations are in order. There are always those in the village who remember things they're not meant to, and then, of course, there's the matter of the next move. Dolly frowned. The next move? Miss Marple reached for her tea again. My dear, when people begin something, they rarely stop at just one step. If this was about vengeance, or justice, or even a game, then I do not think Peter Abbott would be the only unfortunate soul in this affair. Dolly sat back, letting the weight of that settle. Oh dear, that does sound rather ominous, Jane. Miss Marple took a measured sip. Indeed, Dolly, and I rather think we mustn't waste any time. The fire crackled softly in the grate, the warmth at odds with the chill that had settled between them. Outside, St. Mary Mead basked in the golden glow of an early evening, its hedgerows neatly clipped, its cottages standing proud, its people bustling about their ordinary lives. And somewhere among them, hidden in plain sight, was a murderer. Colonel Arthur Bantry was a man who had spent his youth in military regiments, his middle age managing his estate, and his later years perfecting the art of looking imperious while reading the Times. A man of routine, he took his tea with precisely 2 biscuits, he despised unnecessary fuss, and he had a particular knack for absorbing village happenings without appearing to pay them any mind. At present he stood in the drawing-room of the Grange, a sturdy figure in a well-pressed suit, regarding his wife and Miss Marple with the expression of a man who had walked into a battle he had no interest in fighting. He sighed, folding his paper with deliberate care. I take it, he said in his dry, clipped way, that you're discussing the murder? Dolly Bantry waved a hand. Arthur, don't be tiresome, of course we are. You'd hardly expect Jane to come all the way here to discuss my begonias. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in a floral armchair, smiled faintly. Though I am always interested in your gardening, dear. Arthur grunted, moving to pour himself a whiskey from the decanter on the sideboard. Gardening's a damn sight more pleasant than murder, but I suppose there's no stopping the pair of you once you get started. He settled into his chair and took a measured sip. Oh? What have you deduced? Dolly rolled her eyes. You might at least pretend to be helpful. Arthur glanced at Miss Marple, his grey brows lifting. I was under the impression that Jane rarely needs help. Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. Now, Colonel, you do yourself a disservice. I have always found men of military background to be excellent at collecting useful intelligence. I imagine you hear quite a lot, even when you aren't listening. Arthur gave a short chuckle. You're not wrong there. He set down his glass. As it happens, I have heard a thing or two. People talk when they think you aren't paying attention. Dolly leaned forward. Go on, Arthur. He exhaled through his nose, as though irritated by the obligation to contribute, but there was a glint of curiosity in his eye nonetheless. Well, for one thing, Peter Abbott wasn't quite as dull as everyone seems to believe. Miss Marple's fingers twitched over the edge of her knitting. Oh? Arthur nodded. I had a word with Tom Mullins, owns a tobacconist. Said Abbott was seen arguing with a woman last week, middle-aged, well-dressed, not from the village, that much was certain, and the way Tom tells it, Abbott looked like he'd just been given a rather nasty shock. Dolly's eyes widened. A woman? How very interesting. You don't suppose it could have been some old love affair? Arthur gave her a look. For God's sake, Dolly, not everything is a love affair. Miss Marple, however, did not dismiss the notion outright. Did Tom Mullins happen to hear anything of the conversation? Only bits. Something about what was owed and keeping quiet. He reached for his drink again. Ooh, not exactly the usual pleasantries. Dolly exhaled. Well, that is suggestive, isn't it? Someone from his past, perhaps. A debt? Miss Marple was thoughtful. Or a secret he was meant to keep. Arthur gave a short nod. That's what I was thinking, and it does rather tie into the other thing I heard. Dolly, who had been about to take a sip of tea, paused mid-maidment. There's another thing. Arthur sat back. Old Finch, you know, the one who's always rambling on about how the village was better before they put up the new post office, was muttering about something peculiar the other day. Seems he swears he saw a man lurking outside Peter Abbott's house a few nights ago. Tall chap, dark coat, kept to the shadows. Miss Marple adjusted the wool in her lap. And when precisely was this sighting? Arthur tapped his fingers against the chair arm. 2 nights before Abbott died. There was a brief silence, filled only with the ticking of the grandfather clock by the hearth. Dolly was the first to break it. Jane, that can't be a coincidence. Miss Marple's expression was serene, but her eyes were bright with thought. No, Dolly, I don't imagine it is. Arthur took another sip of whiskey. Seems to me this business isn't as cut and dry as Henry Graves would like to believe. Miss Marple gave him a rare, approving nod. I quite agree. She paused, tapping her fingers lightly against her chair's armrest. A woman who speaks of debts and silence, and a man who watches from the shadows. And a playing card left behind, as if to tell us something. Dolly gave a theatrical shiver. It's all very dramatic, isn't it? Miss Marple smiled. Murder usually is. Arthur sighed. Well, if you ask me, there's something else in all this you're overlooking. Dolly frowned. Oh, and what's that? Arthur gave them both a long, knowing look before saying simply, the fact that if someone's gone to all this trouble, they're not finished yet. A hush fell over the room. Outside, the gardens of the Grange stretched lazily in the late afternoon sun, the air heavy with a scent of damp earth and clipped hedges. Somewhere in the village beyond, a dog barked, a short, sharp sound, as if breaking the silence before it settled again. Miss Marple, watching the slow swirl of tea in her cup, murmured almost to herself, No, I rather think they are not. The Bluebell Tea Room was the very heart of St. Mary Mead's social life. At least, where those who preferred their gossip served with a slice of Victoria sponge were concerned. Tucked neatly between the greengrocer's and the post office, it was a small but well-kept establishment, its lace-curtained windows perpetually steamed up from the warmth inside. It was here, on an afternoon of deceptive tranquillity, that Miss Marple and Dolly Bantry took their usual seats near the counter, where they could observe without being immediately observed. The room hummed with quiet chatter, the clinking of porcelain punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Mrs. Broom, the tea-shop's stout proprietress, bustled between tables, her practiced hands ferrying trays of teapots and scones with a remarkable efficiency. Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately, her gaze flickering from table to table. A casual observer might have thought she was merely enjoying a peaceful afternoon with an old friend, but Miss Marple, as always, was listening. "I must say," Dolly began, breaking off a piece of shortbread, "this business about Peter Abbott has set the village quite on edge." "Yes, quite." On cue, a conversation at the next table caught their attention. "Always said there was something odd about him," muttered Mrs. Bartlett, who was holding court with her usual group of cronies. "A man who keeps to himself like that, mark my words, there's always a reason." Miss Hartnell, a retired governess with a particular fondness for moral indignation, sniffed. "Well, I heard from young Nancy at the grocer's that he had visitors at odd hours. Not local folk," she lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Foreigners." Dolly rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "Oh, for heaven's sake, as if having a visitor means one is a criminal." Miss Marple, however, remained focused. Visitors at odd hours, a man who kept to himself. And now a playing card left at the scene of his death. Mrs. Bartlett leaned in closer to her companions, her voice dropping to a whisper, though not so low as to prevent it from carrying. "And then there's the matter of the money." There was a collective hush. Even Mrs. Broom, passing by with a fresh pot of Earl Grey, slowed slightly in her stride. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Now they were getting somewhere. "Money?" Miss Hartle asked, eyes narrowing. Mrs. Bartlett nodded sagely. "Bank clerk told my cousin, well, my cousin's husband, if we're being precise, that Peter Abbott had been withdrawing quite a lot of money recently, and in cash, too." The reaction was immediate. Miss Hartnell gasped. "Well, that's very irregular." Mrs. Sweeting, who had so far been silent, cleared her throat hesitantly. "If I recall correctly, there was another Abbott involved in money trouble some years ago." Miss Marple gently set down her teacup. "Rupert Abbott," she said, just loud enough for the words to be caught. Every head at the table turned to her. Mrs. Bartlett pursed her lips. "Why, yes, now that you mention it." Dolly, ever the willing accomplice, leaned in as if just remembering. "Didn't he leave the village under something of a cloud?" Mrs. Bartlett nodded vigorously. "Oh, most certainly. That was a dreadful scandal in its day. He was the vicar's son, you know. People trusted him." Miss Hartnell sniffed again. "And what did he do? Betrayed that trust, didn't he? Money missing from the church fund, wasn't it?" Mrs. Sweeting shook her head. "No proof, though, only suspicions." Mrs. Bartlett sniffed. "That's because he ran away before anyone could prove it. A guilty conscience, if ever I saw one." Dolly tapped a fingernail against her plate thoughtfully. "And now, years later, another Abbott dies under mysterious circumstances. It does make one wonder." Mrs. Bartlett, emboldened, nodded. "Perhaps someone never forgot what Rupert Abbott did." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her mind working. The village had a long memory, that much was certain, and people never truly forgot grievances. Not in St. Mary Mead. This was no simple crime of impulse. This was a crime rooted in history. And, she suspected, it was far from over. The morning was crisp, the air holding that particular stillness that comes when autumn threatens to turn. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible wool coat, made her way through the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead with the quiet purpose of a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing what others overlooked. Peter Abbott's cottage stood at the end of a small lane, neatly kept, unremarkable in every way, except for the fact that its occupant had been found dead in his chair, with a playing card laid deliberately in front of him. The King of Hearts. Miss Marple had seen many curious things in her time, and she had long since learned that murderers, while often foolish in their crimes, were rarely careless in their symbols. She entered the cottage with the constable's reluctant permission. Henry Graves, having learned the futility of refusing her access, had grumbled but obliged. The sitting room remained much as it had been, too ordinary, too arranged. A small fire had been set in the grate, the tea service on the sideboard untouched, a book of poetry left open on the table, as if to suggest that Mr. Abbot had merely nodded off into death. But then there was the card. Miss Marple studied the table where it had been found, her gloved fingers brushing the polished wood. A single, deliberate clue left, like an exclamation point, not for whimsy nor for mere distraction. This had been a message. She turned to the bookshelf, running her fingers lightly along the spines. Many were standard fare, Dickens, Tennyson, an unassuming row of travelogues. But then her eye caught something, a slim, battered book tucked behind the others. She drew it out and opened the cover. Nonsense rhymes and children's tales. The pages were well thumbed, and as she flicked through, her gaze caught on a particular verse. The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen she wept, the knave he fled, and ne'er was seen again. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the page. A stolen tart, a weeping queen, a fleeing knave, a betrayal, a crime, a disappearance. She closed the book thoughtfully. This was not merely a murder, it was a story on fragments and symbols. The second crime scene from Peter Abbott's cottage, Miss Marple continued to her next stop, the home of Mrs. Alice Pendleton. Mrs. Pendleton had not been murdered, but she had been at the center of another peculiar incident just a fortnight ago. Letters missing, ransacked drawers, nothing of value taken, or so it had seemed. But Mrs. Pendleton had been a woman with a long memory and a keen sense of grievance. Nothing stolen, she had insisted to Miss Marple at the time. But someone wanted something. Miss Marple had thought little of it then. Villages had their petty trespasses. But now, standing once more in the woman's parlor, she reconsidered. A folded napkin had been left on the table the night her letters had been disturbed, a peculiar thing to take note of, and yet Miss Marple moved through the room, noting again the careful placement of items. Nothing overturned, no true sense of disorder, merely the suggestion of disturbance. She studied the napkin on the sideboard, her brow furrowing. It was patterned, she realized now, with delicate embroidery along the edges, and that embroidery depicted a crown. The third site, the church archives. Her final stop was not a crime scene, but it held its own secrets. The small parish archive, a dimly lit room tucked behind the church offices, smelled of old paper and candle wax. The village had kept records for centuries. Births, deaths, land disputes, and, of course, scandals. Miss Marple had requested access with the usual polite persistence. She flipped through the fragile pages of an old ledger, her eyes scanning names, dates, notes scribbled in the margins. And then there it was. Rupert Abbott. His departure had been swift. No formal charges, no court proceedings, only a terse entry: left the parish in haste, dispute over accounts, no further record, but another entry some years later caught her eye: a birth, a child with an unknown father. Miss Marple leaned back, tapping her fingers against the wooden desk. A card left at a murder scene, a stolen tart, a queen who wept, a fleeing knave, the playing card, the napkin, the old grievance. The pattern was emerging, and she had the distinct and unpleasant feeling that it was not yet finished. The village archives were housed in a quiet, dusty chamber at the back of the St. Mary Mead parish office. It was a place rarely disturbed except by the occasional amateur historian or the vicar in search of an obscure baptismal record. The room smelled of aging parchment and candle wax, its dim lighting casting long shadows over the wooden shelves stacked with bound ledgers and yellowed letters. Miss Marple, ever unassuming, had excused herself from the usual village chatter and settled at a narrow desk beneath a weakly flickering gas lamp. The vicar's assistant, a nervous young man named Mr. Wentworth, had granted her access with minimal fuss, though he had given her a curious look as she inquired about records from the late 1800 SS. "Just a bit of genealogical research," she had said sweetly, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. It was in essence the truth. The dead often told more stories than the living. If one only knew where to look. She ran her gloved fingers along the spines of the thick registers, selecting a volume bound in cracked leather. With the precision of someone who had long mastered the art of careful investigation, she leafed through the entries, pausing when a familiar name caught her eye. Rupert Abbott. There it was. His departure from the parish in 1879. The record was brief, almost deliberately so, dismissed from post. Left for London. No further record. Miss Marple pursed her lips. A vicar's son leaving under a cloud was no small thing. St. Mary Mead was a village of long memories and even longer grudges. For a son of the parish to vanish so completely suggested something more than mere impropriety. She turned a few more pages, searching for names she had already begun to suspect, and there, beneath a different entry, years later, yet unmistakably linked, was another Abbott. A child born out of wedlock, mother unknown, father, no entry. A small noise escaped her, a mere hum of thought. Was this the key? A child concealed in records, tied to a scandal long buried? She pressed on, finding an entry concerning a Sarah Pembroke, a name she recognized. Sarah Pembroke had been the housekeeper at the vicarage in Rupert Abbott's day, a respectable woman, yet one who had left St. Mary Mead unexpectedly. A letter was tucked between the pages, its paper frail but its ink still dark. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The matter must not be spoken of. What is done is done. We cannot afford further shame. Unsigned. Miss Marple sat back, tapping her fingers lightly against the desk. Secrets were rarely kept buried forever. They had a way of resurfacing when least expected, disrupting the carefully preserved lives of those who had long since moved on. And now, Peter Abbott was dead. A man with no enemies. A quiet, retired schoolmaster, a man whose family had vanished from the village's consciousness. Until now, she closed the ledger and rose, smoothing her skirt. A vendetta was unfolding, and she had a very strong suspicion that Peter Abbott had not been its intended target. Merely the first link in a chain that was about to tighten around the past. She needed to speak to Dolly Bantry, and quickly. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple arrived at the small, ivy-covered cottage at the edge of the village. The scent of wood smoke lingered in the crisp air, mingling with the faint perfume of overgrown lavender from the untended garden. She knocked briskly on the door, stepping back as the sound of slow, shuffling movement reached her ears from within. Moments later, the door creaked open to reveal Edith Phelps, one of St. Mary Mead's oldest residents, and, as Miss Marple knew, one of its most reliable keepers of inconvenient history. Miss Phelps had the air of someone who had once been a formidable woman, now softened by age but not by temperament. She peered out at her visitor, sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Well, if it isn't Jane Marple. Come about him, have you?" Miss Marple smiled in the way one does when one is not at all surprised to be expected. "If by him you mean Peter Abbott, then yes, dear. And may I say how lovely your roses are looking? I do so admire the way they thrive, even when left mostly to their own devices." Miss Phelps gave a snort but stepped aside. "Come in, then. But don't go talking nonsense about my garden. The place is a disgrace, and I know it." The interior of the cottage was much like its owner, stubbornly resistant to modernity. Heavy furniture loomed in the dim light, a grandfather clock ticking in the corner. A single coal fire burned low in the hearth, and a silver tray with a half-empty teacup suggested Edith had been midway through an afternoon of contemplation. Miss Marple allowed herself to be directed to an armchair with as much grace as one might when settling into something that had likely been last reupholstered in 1875. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "You knew Rupert Abbott, did you not?" she asked gently. Miss Phelps gave her a long look, then sighed. "Knew him. Everyone knew him. The vicar's son, charming as the devil, always had a way about him. And, like the devil, he got himself into trouble he couldn't talk his way out of." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The matter of the missing church funds?" Edith let out a dry laugh. "Oh, there were more than just missing funds, my dear. There was a missing future. A missing light." Miss Marple remained silent, waiting. She had long since learned that if one allowed silence to stretch just long enough, it became unbearable to those who held secrets. Edith sighed. "Sarah Pembroke. She was the real scandal, though no one wanted to admit it." The name was not unexpected, but Miss Marple allowed her brows to rise slightly, prompting more. Edith shook her head. "Dee was the housekeeper's niece. Came to stay when she was barely 17. Pretty girl, clever, but from the wrong sort of family. Too ambitious for her own good, some said." She gave a wry smile. "Too trusting, if you ask me." Miss Marple's fingers twitched slightly over the edge of her handbag. "She trusted Rupert Abbott." "Trusted," Edith repeated bitterly. "Loved, same thing in the end," she exhaled, rubbing her hands together as if recalling something unpleasant. "She was ruined, of course, you could see it plain as day. And then, all of a sudden, Rupert Abbott vanished, just packed up and left overnight. No explanation, no farewell." Miss Marple hesitated, then asked quietly, "And Sarah?" Edith's gaze darkened. "Gone too not long after. Sent away, they said. Some quiet arrangement was made, as they used to do, and just like that it was as if neither of them had ever existed. The village got on with its business as it always does." Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. "Do you believe," she asked at last, "that Sarah's departure was voluntary?" Edith's mouth tightened. "Let's just say that in those days young women didn't get many choices in such matters." A log in the fireplace crackled, sending up a brief flare of light that cast flickering shadows across Edith's lined face. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Miss Phelps," she said gently, "do you believe that someone has not forgotten?" Edith's gaze flicked to hers, sharp as a needle. "My dear Jane," she said, voice low, "no one ever forgets." A hush settled between them, the ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound in the dimly lit room. Miss Marple, ever the picture of politeness, took a final sip of her tea, then set the cup back onto the tray with deliberate care. "Yes," she murmured, more to herself than to her host. "That is precisely what I was afraid of."